Our second speaker is Charles Heller, who is a researcher and filmmaker whose work explores and has a long-standing focus on the politics of migration. He has finished his PhD in 2015 with research architecture at Goldsmiths, and has also been a long-term collaborator of forensic architecture. And his spin-off, let's say, if I may say that, is called Forensic Oceanography, which really deals with what I think is a very innovative way of exploring and also contesting the politics of migration today. So, Charles, I give the Zoom floor to you.
Thank you so much, Kenny, for the introduction, and to the organizers for having us. I would love to be physically, to have us all physically present and be able to exchange much more informally, but I'm nonetheless delighted to join you in this way as well. So my name's Charles Heller, and as Kenny briefly mentioned, I'm a transdisciplinary researcher and practitioner. My work somehow lies at the intersection between spatial analysis and practice, media studies and production, and human rights practice. And the main focus of my work over the last 15 years or so has been on migration and the violence of borders, specifically at the maritime frontier within the Forensic Oceanography project that I co-initiated and co-direct with my colleague, Lorenzo Pizzani. Oh, for some reason I'm not able, there you go. So within this project, which emerged from within the broader Forensic Architecture Agency, which I'll mention in more detail in a minute, we've been producing human rights investigations using various remote sensing tools, mapping. Here you see some figures from our report on the Left to Die boat case, which I'll mention in a bit more detail in a minute. And these reports have been the basis for various cases of strategic litigation in front of national and international courts. They form the basis as well, the kind of empirical basis, if you will, for more theoretical reflections on, for example, the evolution of the border regime, also reflective thinking on the very use of some of these technologies usually used for surveillance and the way we try to mobilize them against the grain. And our work also leads to various maps, but also videos that are shown in the art and architecture context. Now, our work has been very much influenced by the particular approach to architecture as a spatial and research practice that is exemplified by the Center for Research Architecture, but also clearly by many other institutions, including the Critical Urbanism program in Basel. And A.L. Weitzman's work maybe serves as an entry point to this broader approach to architecture. A.L. wrote this rather famous book by now, more than 10 years ago, called Hollow Land, on Israel's architecture of occupation. And in this book, Eyal is really looking at the different spatial practices and structure that enable the Israeli occupation over the Palestinian territories, and offers a series of probes into the modus operandi and spatial mechanisms that have sustained and continue to sustain the occupation's regime and practices of control. This ranges from this map here, you see a map of the different jurisdictional zones that shape this overlapping sovereignty structure of the occupation, a map which at the time initially, Eyal initially drew it, was in fact far from common. It has become much more common today. But Eyal also looks at various spatial practices, such as the use of the technique of walking through walls and swarming, adopted by the Israeli Defense Forces in their incursions in Gaza, for example. And this approach to architecture and spatial analysis has been absolutely fundamental to our own project, focusing on the maritime borders of Europe, another frontier territory, which also operates a politics of separation and hierarchization of mobility and rights. A second way that Eyal's thinking has influenced us is with another shift that he and others initiated within the Center for Research Architecture, again, some 10 years ago. And this was the shift towards forensic architecture, a particular architectural take on what Eyal, Tom Keenan, Sujin Shupli, others identified as what we refer to as the forensic turn in human rights, i.e. the growing use of a broad range of technologies, forms of evidence to contest human rights violations in front of different legal forums. I'm showing here a slide from the press conference by UN Rapporteur Richard Goldstone into the 2007-2008, I believe, Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, in which was a very important moment in the emergence of forensic architecture. Fittingly, Richard Goldstone is standing in front of the debris of this operation. And this for a very simple reason. The majority of the more than 1,400 civilians who died in this military intervention died as the result of mostly their very homes crumbling onto their bodies. Architecture in this instance had become weaponized within the conflict, if you will. But at the same time as architecture was becoming a weapon of war, something that is clearly not specific to the Israeli-Palestine context, but that we can see at work in different contexts. At the same time as architecture had become a weapon of war, it could also be reversed engineered, so to speak, and brought to witness, to bear witness for how it was made to kill. And Goldstone's report relied heavily on the analysis, the ballistic analysis of destroyed Palestinian homes and buildings, and analyzed the legality or illegality of these practices. Since then, forensic architecture as an agency has really dramatically grown and really brought an architectural edge, if you will, a spatial edge to these broad range of technologies and forms of evidence that are used to document violations across the globe. Now, these approaches were really fundamental to our own project as we sought to bring it to bear on the particular form of violence operating at and through the sea at the EU's maritime frontiers. You're aware, I'm sure, that this is a long-standing phenomena with more than 40,000 documented deaths at the EU's borders since the beginning of the 90s. And this form of violence does have an architectural dimension to it. We could think of an architectural dimension simply at work in the very overall organization of the border regime, which since the early 90s, at the time when a space of freedom of movement was being instituted within the EU and for European citizens, this regime simultaneously entailed the denial of access to EU territory for most migrants of the global south. So this is a highly discriminatory and unequal regime. But as migrants and citizens from the global south did not simply accept it passively, if you will, their assignation, their spatial assignation, and sought to migrate towards Europe, despite legal denial to do so. This has not led to the end of migration from the global south, but rather to the illegalization of the mobility of these migrants and the emergence of an enduring form of mobility conflict between Europe and the global south. Europe is clearly not the only zone of mobility conflict. We see these emerge across the globe, wherever the policies, the restrictive policies of states clash with the desires and movements of migrants. So we can think of an architecture of the European border regime in this broad sense of spatial organization and basic organization principles. But if we zoom into the Mediterranean, where again, more than 40,000 people have died at sea, mostly of what we called liquid violence, in the sense that the majority of migrants who died at the EU's frontiers do not die from border guards shooting at them, but as a result of the sea made dangerous to their mobility as a result of these exclusionary practices. If we look more closely at the sea, we see that there's an architecture of the maritime space as well, which was not at all a lawless zone, as you might expect from looking at Google Maps, for example, but rather a space saturated by multiple overlapping jurisdictions. And in particular, for what concerns us, in red indicated here, different search and rescue zones within which states are responsible for organizing rescue. Now, these overlaps, in fact, generate structural conflicts between different states as to their responsibility. And they allow states to selectively expand their rights, for example, to intercept migrants at sea, or to retract from their obligations, for example, when they refrain from operating rescue at sea. So understanding this political geography of the maritime frontier was absolutely fundamental for us, both to understand the way border violence operates, but also to be able to spatialize incidents at sea and seek to locate responsibility in the sea of impunity. We did this first in relation to a case known as the Left to Die boat case, an incident in 2011 when 72 people left the Libyan coast in the direction of Italy and were abandoned at sea for 14 days of drift, despite interaction with a number of state actors, including the Italian Coast Guard, but also the military of different states taking part in the NATO intervention against Libya at the time. Because there was only a single image that we could access, to reconstruct this incident, we had to rely on a wide range of forms of evidence, starting firstly, and of course, by the very testimonies of the survivors, the 9 survivors who endured this deadly drift. We conducted detailed interviews with them, seeking to spatialize their movements and their different encounters at sea. And in addition to these testimonies, we relied, for example, on this photograph, this only photograph of the event, which was taken by a French patrol aircraft and sent to the Italian Coast Guard in Rome, along with the exact coordinates, spatial coordinates of the boat at the time. The Italian Coast Guard subsequently sent out a distress message to all vessels transiting in the area, demanding that they look out and assist the passengers in distress, indicating as well the exact spatial coordinates for the boat. We then called upon an oceanographer to reconstruct the drift of the boat from the moment it ran out of fuel after less than 24 hours on the basis of wind and current data. And in this way, we were able to reconstruct day by day the trajectory of the boat. And you see that there's a decreasing margin of error starting from the point of drift, which is estimated to the known point of landing back on the Libyan coast. And we then asked ourselves, well, where were the many large vessels of the military operating in the area that failed to assist the drifting boat. And to this effect, to try and answer this question, we resorted to the use of synthetic aperture radar imagery, a form of satellite image that uses radar beamed from outer space. The resolution of that image is only of 75 meters, and thus only allows us to detect the presence of large vessels in the area, several of which must have been military. The closest vessels were less than 2 hours from the drifting boat, indicated in yellow here at the time. And in this way, we reconstructed in detail the entire trajectory of this boat from the moment of its departure from Libya throughout its different moments of interaction indicated with these points A, B, C, and D, and its lethal drift throughout 14 days in NATO's maritime surveillance area. And this led to several cases in front of different national courts in Spain, France, Italy, and Belgium, cases that are some of which are still ongoing or coming to a close, and the collective hopes to bring them to the European Court of Human Rights soon. But there are other forms of spatial practices at the maritime frontier that have lethal effects. And this was another instance, not of practices of non-assistance, but of a veritable policy of non-assistance with a deeply spatial dimension, which we document in this report, Deaths by Rescue, the lethal effects of the EU's policies of non-assistance, concerning the ending of the Mare Nostrum operation between 2014 and 2015. And we show that essentially this ending had a deeply spatial dimension. You see here in green indicated the operational zone of Mare Nostrum, and in purple indicated the operational zone of the Frontex-led operation called Triton, much smaller, further north in relation to the Libyan coast, and which far fewer means, and also with an entirely different logic, that of border control instead of proactive rescue. What happens is that essentially, while Italy had launched the Mare Nostrum operation in 2013 to respond to the growing number of deaths at sea, it was soon accused of constituting a pull factor, enabling more migrants to arrive safely on European shores. And as a result, the EU refused to Europeanize this operation in 2014 and proposed this much more limited Frontex-led operation instead. However, at the time, many organizations, including Amnesty, for example, decried this operational shift, arguing that people will attempt the crossing with or without Operation Mare Nostrum in place, but without it, many more will die. These lethal consequences were even acknowledged by Frontex in its own internal reports, but nevertheless, the EU and Italy pressed on with this operational shift, which effectively created a lethal search and rescue vacuum that led to a staggering increase in the number of deaths at sea. So here you have a very clear example of the way border violence is always also a form of spatial violence, a form of violence that is deeply spatialized, here not at the scale of vessels surrounding migrants' boats at sea, but of an entire operational zone that was pulled back in the aims of acting as a deterrent. Clearly, the Mediterranean is not the only zone where these mobility conflicts crystallize and stark and violent bordering practices. And today, our project is initiating a new important shift, some nearly 10 years after we initiated our project, which is the shift from forensic oceanography to border forensics, through which we will seek to document forms of violence in other border zones, such as the Sahara, the Alps, the Balkans, and others. That is beyond the sea. But our hope is also to analyze the uneven relations that materialize in these border zones, in particular through nexuses of uneven mobility and infrastructures, so as to foreground the uneven relations that connect Europe to the global South, uneven relations which really produce and sustain the mobility conflict that we see at work today. And I believe these are really the relations that need to be transformed to durably bring an end to the violations of migrants' rights at the shifting borders of Europe and bring an end to the mobility conflict itself. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.